Secretary, your testimony delivered here this morning in written form has come close to this issue, but let me ask you directly. In the 7 months between the time the Bush administration took office and September 11th, to your knowledge, did Mr. Clark ever present to the Bush administration a new plan for dealing with al-Qaeda? Or was he, along with the rest of the NSC staff and the counterterrorism group, working on the NSPD that was eventually produced in September without any complaint that things had to be done before that time?
To the best of my knowledge, and I'll ask Deputy Secretary Armitage
to
comment on this because he was so intimately involved, is that in the early part of the 7-month period and coming to sort of a climax in April, we started to pull together the various threads of a new policy. But I'm not aware of a specific new plan that had been put forward. Dr. Rice had asked for a comprehensive study to be done of everything that we were doing up to that point from the previous administration, any new ideas that would come along. But I'm not aware of a specific new plan that was presented for consideration by the principals for action by the National Security Council.
No, I did not see a plan either, but it's quite clear, Governor, that Dick Clark, who participated in most of the DCs in which Deputies Committee meetings in which I participated, was quite impatient and was pushing the process quite well.
Mr. Secretary, taking into account both your military background and your present diplomatic position, in your opinion, would military aid to the Northern Alliance during the period February 91 to September 91 have prevented 9/11?
No.
Would more frequent principals meetings in that period or more small group meetings in that period prevented 9/11?
No, and I'm not quite sure I've followed the rationale between more meetings and preventing 9/11. We met constantly. It wasn't always at principals level, but there was no lack of communication between the principals. There was no lack of exchange of information and data. I was briefed every morning by my intelligence people, so were all of the other principals. The President got daily briefings from the Director of Central Intelligence, and we consulted with each other about all of these issues. So I don't think it was a lack of meetings that resulted in 9/11, if that's the suggestion.
In your opinion, would an invasion of Afghanistan between February of 91 and September of 91 prevented September 11th?
I can't answer that, but I can say that those who were perpetrators of 9/11, who were actually going to conduct the attacks of 9/11, already had their instructions, they had their plans in place, and they were in the process of infiltrating themselves into the United States, or they were already here. And invading Afghanistan and cutting off the head, if you succeeded in getting Osama bin Laden and disrupting al-Qaeda at that point, I have no reason to believe that would have caused them to abort their plans.
In fact, NATO is in Afghanistan today, and yet everyone who has testified before this commission or been interviewed by this commission still fears that we may yet suffer another attack on our own soil. Is that not correct?
That's correct. Al-Qaeda has tentacles in many different parts of the world. We've been very successful. We believe we have eliminated a significant portion of the senior leadership that we knew about, but this does not eliminate the entire organization, and it is not the only organization that means us ill.
Let me take you back to the time you took office early in 1991. Would you give us a summary version of the most pressing foreign policy issues that the nation, in your opinion, faced, how you rank them, and where counterterrorism fit into this order of priority?
There's no question that counterterrorism was in the top tier on this list. It's very difficult to rank order them because they just come rushing in at you, and you have to deal with them as they come. I would say the Middle East peace problem was right there. One of the top ones. The discussions that President Clinton and Mrs. Albright, Dr. Albright, were having with the Palestinians and Israelis had essentially fallen apart just before inauguration. And in fact, President Clinton and I spoke about it on his last day in office that afternoon of January 19th and expressed his disappointment that it didn't work. So that was a top one. Sanctions were falling apart with respect to Iraq, and we had to arrest that collapse of the sanctions policy. We were interested in a new relationship, what our relationship would be with Russia, with China. And so lots of things press in, and you have to deal with all of them. But there's no doubt that counterterrorism and terrorism was high on that list. The very reason the very first briefing I got was on terrorism. And Dr. Albright, Secretary Albright, certainly made clear that she thought it was a high priority. I was announced on Saturday, the 16th, and the very next day, Sunday the 17th, I met with Dr. Albright at her home for the first time to start talking about these issues.
In May of 1991, you testified before the Senate Appropriations Committee, and you said, "In my first 3 months, I'm very satisfied with the level of interagency coordination and cooperation." And you made specific reference to the FBI and the CIA. Now, I realize you're only on the job 3 months at that time, but in light of what we've all heard since that time about the difficulties in getting the FBI and the CIA together on the issue of Al-Qaeda, do you think you were being a little optimistic about the degree of coordination?
I was getting a steady stream of information from Director Tennant. I read the same thing the President read every morning, and the PDB, as it's known, and you're well familiar with it. The PDB regularly talked about terrorist activities. My own intelligence operation, INR, fed me with a steady stream. I met on a regular basis, occasional basis, regular basis, with Director Free. I had access to FBI information. So I didn't feel that there was a lack of coordination or a lack of communications and interchange between the principals.
All of us, I'm sure, have a strong desire to prevent another Afghanistan. And there are places in the world, are there not, Mr. Secretary, either in Africa or Southeast Asia that present that threat? Would you tell us, please, what the administration and you are doing both diplomatically and militarily to head off this threat of another Afghanistan?
Right after 9/11, even before 9/11, we started to work with the countries of Central Asia. Uzbekistan, we knew, would be an important nation in this regard. And after 9/11, we put a full court press on all of the nations of Central Asia, not only for access for our troops to do their work in Afghanistan, but to create new relations with them. And all of them have expressed a desire to have friendly relationship, and in some cases a partnership with the United States. And we did this very sensitive to Russia's concerns about the United States being in that part of the world. But we were able to persuade the Russians over time that we had a common enemy in terrorism, and they should not fear the United States having these kinds of relations with Central Asian nations. We also looked at some of the nations in Africa, for example, Somalia, which was without a government. Secretary Rumsfeld, and I'm sure he'll testify to this, has been looking at our footprint around the world to see how best we can deploy our forces to deal with those nations of the world and those regions of the world that have the potential of serving as safe havens for terrorist activities. For example, we have a presence in Djibouti now that we didn't have previously, because we're concerned about the possibility of terrorists finding safe havens in that part of the world. So I think we have, through our diplomatic efforts, our intelligence efforts, and our military footprinting, been very sensitive to the need to get ahead of the terrorists and to dry up these fertile places. Part of our public diplomacy effort goes to this effort as well.
One last question.
If I may.
Yes, go ahead, Mr.
There's one other element that the Secretary has made a big part of our policy, the Department of State, and that is that a big portion of our assistance programs for almost every country is in good governance and democracy, because you're not going to have a failed state we feel, if you have good, transparent governance and democracy. So, it's not that it's new. I think the amount of attention, the amount of money going to it is new, and it's raised.
Prior to September 11th, would it have been possible, either for the Clinton administration or the Bush administration, to say to either the Saudis or the Pakistanis, as the president did after September 11th, you're either with us or against us?
It's not clear how you would have communicated such a message and under what set of circumstances. What would you have been saying to the Pakistanis at that point that would have persuaded them that it was a choice they had to make? After 9/11, it was clear to the Pakistanis that we were going to take action against al-Qaeda, and if that included taking action against the Taliban, if that included going into Afghanistan and removing that regime, we were going to do it. And what we were essentially saying to them at that point, you've got to be with us. And I think without that kind of imperative, 9/11 plus the fact that we were determined to invade a country, if that's what it took, to get rid of this threat, I'm not sure you would have gotten the kind of response from the Pakistanis that we got on the 14th of September.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.